Well, anybody really who goes to work could be put at risk if their employers fail to take care for their health and safety at work. I'm regularly contacted by people who are still being exposed to asbestos in their workplaces or in their homes, which are owned by councils, for example, or even private landlords. So there's still an awful lot of ignorance about the hazards that substance poses, but there are also lots of other causes of industrial disease. And so anybody who goes to work is potentially at risk. The range of conditions graduates in severity, culminating with malignant mesothelioma, which is a form of cancer which affects the lining of the lungs or the heart or the abdomen, and which can develop many decades after exposure. Unfortunately, as things stand, there's no known cure for this illness. So anyone given that diagnosis is effectively being handed a death sentence. Mesothelioma can be caused by quite low levels of asbestos dust and fibres. Now, these get lodged in the lungs or around the lungs, and they can just remain there for many decades. And then suddenly there will be a malignant change, and the illness progresses and manifests itself fully. So from then, unfortunately, the prognosis is very poor for people, and most people will survive for an average of about a further 12 months. It can affect everybody involved with the person who's developed the illness, because if they're unable to work, then the family, it can cause problems financially for the families. If they become very ill, then family members often end up caring for them or doing things for them and taking on responsibilities which they hadn't had to previously. So you can find a situation where, for example, a father becomes ill, adult children then end up being carers, sometimes for both parents. It can cause incredible pressures on the family. Sadly, it's not a thing of the past at all. We continue to see new industrial diseases, and increasingly I'm finding that people are being affected by chemicals at work. That's certainly a growth area in my area of law. So as well as dealing with the historical cases which arise out of exposure, say, to asbestos from the 1940s, 50s onwards, I have clients who come to me who are still being exposed to either excessive noise or to toxic fumes from paint, say. So it's very much a current problem, and one which shows no signs of going away, I'm afraid. So it's always a shocking diagnosis to receive, and that's generally because people have worked or been exposed to asbestos many decades previously, and it can come completely out of the blue. So it's difficult for people to deal with. The other thing which is very hard for them to confront sometimes is that their illness may have been caused by other family members who may have brought asbestos into the home, for example, on their work overalls, which somebody else has laundered, or I have worked with people who have developed mesothelioma after just going to hug their dads when they've come home from work in their work overalls. So, the difficulty that the family then have to face is that they too may have been exposed to asbestos, and it is like a ticking time bomb. People have this hanging over them for the rest of their lives. If you do develop mesothelioma or another serious asbestos-related disease, then you will get a lot of help and support from the medical team at the hospital where you're a patient. usually there are specialist nurses who are extremely skilled at help advising you, talking through treatment options with you. And there may be a number of options available which can actually improve your quality of life and extend your life expectancy. There are several reasons really why someone should seek expert legal advice if they receive a serious diagnosis of an industrial disease such as with mesothelioma. Quite often there are feelings of anger towards the companies or the employers who have caused the exposure which has led to the development of the disease. And so people are seeking to have their illnesses recognised by those responsible. Another reason for them to consult a lawyer is that lawyers can help them access industrial injuries benefits and also help them obtain early interim payments, which can provide for everyday aids and equipment which become necessary once the disease progresses. So say, for example, somebody lives in a house with stairs, but they can't actually get up the stairs because they're so out of breath. An interim payment or a benefits payment can help pay for the installation of a stair lift and mean that they can actually remain at home. So in a very practical way, a lawyer can help them at an early stage. As they become accustomed to the prognosis and the diagnosis they've received, then my experience is that their attention tends to turn to trying to make sure that their family members are actually provided for financially after they've died. And so the attention goes away from them towards those who are close to them instead. I started out my career doing lots of different types of law, but I gradually developed an interest in workplace injury, so firstly dealing with workplace accidents. Then I started representing miners in Yorkshire who'd been injured underground. And then I moved to a firm who had a lot of asbestos disease work, and that's when I got involved in that particular area. The beginnings of a case involve my going to visit the person who's developed the illness, sometimes in the company of their families, and I have to take a very detailed history from them about their work and how they've been exposed to asbestos and how it's affected them so far. From there, I have to start digging into the past to try and trace the companies they worked for, many of whom have long since gone out of business. So in order to be able to pursue a case in those circumstances, I then have to try and trace the company's insurers for the relevant period. All of this requires some excavation and lateral thinking, and I try and contact potential witnesses to see whether they can help. So there's a lot of investigation to be done to try and trace the people who I then have to pursue for my clients. So the individuals that I'm representing have often worked in heavy industry in the past. So from the 1950s onwards, there are certain industries which are associated with heavy industrial use of asbestos, including the shipbuilding industry, the railways, power stations, and more generally in construction. So that could cover any of a number of different tradesmen. So generally we'll be suing companies who have been major employers in those types of industries, but increasingly I have to try and trace quite small companies. And that becomes more difficult because it's more difficult to find their insurers and to be able to pursue them. I think as far as asbestos disease is concerned, that sadly the cases are still on the increase, and they're not now expected to peak until 2020. And after that, there will be a gradual decline, but it may take a long time before the numbers really start to decrease significantly. There are still lots of people who are at risk of developing asbestos diseases, even from asbestos that was installed in buildings decades ago, which hasn't yet been removed. So for anyone who's in the building maintenance trades, they could find themselves being exposed to asbestos dust if it's not been properly documented where it is in a building which they go to work in. And another category of people who are potentially going to be affected in the future are those who have been exposed to low levels of dust from, say, their parents or even their grandparents when they were children, because it's believed that children are actually more susceptible to developing these illnesses, their immune systems being less robust than those of adults. In that regard, another concern is for school children and indeed for staff who have been in schools where, particularly in the 60s, many of the buildings were constructed from asbestos materials, which inevitably became degraded. And so there is still a concern that there's a lot of asbestos still in school buildings and that people are being exposed to low levels of dust. So increasingly we're seeing the trends move from heavy industrial exposure to people who are developing the disease now, who have actually had very light exposure. And many of them are professional people working in hospitals, schools, and so on. So we're seeing a change in the profile of the kind of people who are affected by these illnesses. It can be tricky for me because as I get to know people, as I'm working with them, I start understanding what they've gone through, what the problems they're currently having to deal with. And I do feel a personal responsibility, really, to help them through this difficult time and to do what I can to get them justice. I feel that there's a great injustice that has been done to working people who have been exposed quite innocently on their part to some kind of hazard at work. They've often been working in very difficult conditions, and through no fault of their own, just through going to work, they end up, sometimes many decades later, developing very serious illnesses. And I've seen the devastating effect that has both on them and on their families. And so that's what really motivates me to fight for them.